President Bill Clinton signed into law the Telecommunications Act of 1996, he presented it as an attempt to deregulate various types of communications industries, allowing existing companies to broaden their offerings to consumers. While the intention may have been to increase competition, breaking down the regulatory walls would lead to a massive consolidation of media delivery in the USA, ironically facilitating the rise of full-on telecom oligopolies, the exact thing the law was trying to fight against. These newly christened megaliths of corporations, however, would make large investments into communications infrastructure in the country, directly facilitating the great expansion of a new kind of technology: the Internet. Title V of Clinton's telecommunications overhaul was called the Communications Decency Act, the first attempt by lawmakers to regulate obscene content on the internet. While it may be hard to believe with how things currently are now, the information superhighway in its early years was seen as the last frontier of absolute unhindered free speech, and chronically online individuals of the era were known for their libertarian ideals. As you can imagine, Big Brother stepping in and trying to mess with their perfect utopia of free expression was seen as nothing less than an intrusion. One of these early netizens reading through the Communications Decency Act would come across something very interesting in the legislation. Section 230.
No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider.
It would spark an idea. You'd buy a domain name for $100 and would slowly cobble together a website intended for users to submit whatever photos they wanted. Gore, mutilation, devastation, it didn't matter. As long as it was submitted by users, it would be protected by a law designed to keep this exact kind of content off the internet. The perfect form of protest. Soon enough, this new website filled with images of carnage and death would seemingly find its way into every web ring that had a dark and disturbing section, swiftly spreading around the internet like a disease.
Rodden.com.
While internet users were reeling in the novelty of the web's very first shock site, another enthusiast would also use Section 230 to their advantage, but this time to do some good. Brewster Kahle, an already acclaimed engineer who had previously spearheaded some of the first known search engine projects in the 80s, had a bit of capital to spend from those early successes, $15 million to be exact. While he could have retired young or invested into some hot new startup, Brewster had a greater vision. He noticed that the internet had a problem, one that he intended to fix. You see, the internet of 1996 was mostly made up of individually made web pages. People would write HTML files from scratch and use a hosting service to serve them over the web. While content on the modern internet usually only gets deleted or removed on purpose, these early web pages often went down for a myriad of reasons. Whether it was exceeded bandwidth limits, physical server failures, or simply because of link rot, the early internet may have held the promise of one day becoming humanity's greatest ever index of information, but it was about as reliable as a library in a wildfire. To fix this, Kahle would launch the Internet Archive, a non-profit platform designed to copy and preserve as much of the internet as possible. He'd use his extensive knowledge of search engine technology to build web crawlers that would sprawl the web looking for new pages to preserve, and also indexing new copies of previously archived sites. While the Internet Archive would spend the next few years successfully preserving much of the 1990s internet, it wasn't a very commonly known project. There just wasn't much a normal user could see on the platform. If you were an academic researcher, you could request access to specific archive pages, but otherwise, the archives themselves weren't accessible to outside users. That would change in October 2001, when the Internet Archive launched a tool that became an instant hit and skyrocketed the project's notoriety: the Wayback Machine. With the addition of the Wayback Machine, you could simply enter in a URL, choose a date, and see how that website used to look. In this era, when the web was constantly morphing and changing, it was pretty cool to be able to see how those changes have played out over time. People also found enjoyment in the fact that the Internet Archive didn't seem to have any limits on the types of content they would preserve, no matter how explicit it was. One user would try typing in Rodden.com, and sure enough, that site was archived too. Not terribly surprising, as that platform had also gone on to gain an immense level of notoriety by 2001, but here, you'll notice something weird. The captures have been steady throughout 2000 and the first half of 2001, but then they just abruptly stop. The next capture wouldn't be until January 2002, and the archives would remain sparse until 2003, when they suddenly resumed at their usual velocity. What could cause such a big hole in the archives of such a noteworthy site? Maybe analyzing the captures a little closer might help us learn more. They appear to fall off a cliff around September. What could have happened in September 2001?
Welcome back to the program. We've got some breaking news to tell you about something we're just learning about ourselves here. Apparently, a small passenger plane has crashed into one of the World Trade Towers. This, of course, in Manhattan, New York City. These are live shots we're just getting right now.
9/11 would greatly amplify the public profiles of both Rotten.com and the Internet Archive, the latter of whom would collaborate with the Library of Congress to create the September 11th Web Archive, which preserved digital coverage of the tragedy by both the news media and individuals, in turn giving the organization a powerful piece of institutional recognition. Rotten, on the other hand, had a bit of a different response. Shortly after the tragedy unfolded, the site would launch a new page titled
Swan Dive.
Supposedly, the page was nothing but an image gallery, one that displayed pictures depicting scenes from September 11th. But it wasn't just a general collection of photos. No, it was specifically focused on one type of scene. When the planes hit the Twin Towers, thousands of people were inside the two buildings. Some of them were able to escape through stairwells and out the front door, but only those who were lucky enough to be on one of the floors below where the planes hit. Those on the floors above were essentially stranded, and they faced an incredibly harrowing decision. Onlookers would soon start to notice what appeared to be people leaning out of the broken windows on the top floors of the World Trade Center, most of them spotted on the North Tower. With smoke and fire slowly making its way into every corner of the buildings, well, I don't need to tell you what they were considering doing. The New York Times would later state that up to 200 people may have died as a result of falling from the Twin Towers. Officials would designate these deaths as homicides, as they ruled that these poor souls were essentially forced out of the burning buildings. Writer Brian Doyle's haunting 2002 essay Leap describes this very humanly tragic aspect of 9/11, with the whole thing revolving around a pair who were spotted falling while holding hands. Their identities are unknown. Rotten.com's Swan Dive was a less tactful record of this horrible fate. They were likely the first website on the internet to host images of this more visibly tragic subsection of 9/11 victims. The page was created by the main admin of the site, a user who went by the name Soylent. In reality, he was software engineer Thomas E. Dell, and as exploitative as a Swan Dive page was, you could see what this free speech absolutist was likely thinking when he made it. While the media initially did show graphic images of people falling from the Twin Towers, intense public backlash led to basically all media coverage avoiding showing these tragedies playing out. Some big broadcasters like ABC would even institute network-wide bans on the photos, and within a week of 9/11, the most photographed disaster in history suddenly had a mysterious hole in its visual records. With Rotten.com being created to test the limits of free speech on the internet, Swan Dive, as exploitatively as it was framed, was clearly a challenge to this gap in 9/11 media coverage, one that would trigger the creation of a different kind of gap on a different platform. While the Internet Archive was busy digitally preserving any and all coverage of 9/11 they could find on the internet, they would mysteriously leave this one piece of it out. In fact, because they failed to capture multiple consecutive months of Rotten.com, we actually only know that Swan Dive exists in the first place because of contemporary discussion about it on the internet that did luckily survive the test of time. It's unknown why the Internet Archive suddenly stopped capturing Rotten.com. They've never clarified why the gap in coverage exists, but many theorize that it was the very first line in the sand drawn by the organization. While they are usually fairly lenient in preserving just about anything they legally can, they do occasionally make purposeful decisions to delete content, something that directly contrasts with the organization's mission statement. In some cases, it's because legal action was taken and they simply had no choice but to remove something. In other cases, however, it was decided that a piece of internet history was simply too horrible or dangerous to be remembered. Swan Dive may have been the first case of this happening, but it wouldn't be the last. In 2022, the Internet Archive would again make the rare decision to remove content. This time, however, it wasn't just a few months of captures. It was the entire archive of a whole platform. To put into perspective how significant of a move this was, the organization has repeatedly refused requests to remove all manner of extremist content. In 2019 alone, they refused 550 takedown requests from Europol that targeted terrorist propaganda archived on the platform, although it's worth mentioning many of these requests falsely targeted unrelated content. The archive has also gone into multiple controversies over the years for hosting neo-Nazi and Holocaust denial content, with Brewster Kahle alleging that the archive functions as a library rather than a publisher, and that even this malicious content can be useful to scholars, journalists, and law enforcement. If this is how things usually are for the Internet Archive, then what could be so bad that they would voluntarily decide to remove something themselves? Well, in this case, it was.
The Kiwi Farms.
For many of you watching who are familiar with commentary content on YouTube, a niche which mine and many other horror channels tend to be adjacent to, if not directly partaking in ourselves, this might seem like an odd decision. You may know the Kiwi Farms as a place that documents the online activities of controversial internet figures, like Darkside Phil, Boogie2988, or Only Use Me Blade. Chances are, if you've watched some 2-hour documentary on YouTube focused around the rise and fall of one of these creators, the Kiwi Farms will inevitably be cited as a source. For some of these more well-known controversial influencers and creators, the Kiwi Farms represents one side of a toxic symbiotic relationship. The terminally online and often troubled users of the forum will go to enormous lengths to document and mock every piece of activity from these figures. The creators being documented will publicly detest this, and they will cite their trolls as being the source of their life's ills. At the same time, they'll continue to overshare their personal lives on the internet. Somebody like Boogie2988 will publicly seethe about everyone who discusses his personal life, while at the same time constantly revealing sensitive private information about himself. At the end of the day, this brand of controversial creators make their living solely from the attention they get from their detractors, and one could theorize that they might get some sort of depraved personal satisfaction out of seeing themselves being discussed by others so frequently. Even for channels like mine, the Kiwi Farms can be a valuable resource. If I were to make a video about Smart Schoolboy 9, for example, I would almost certainly end up having to visit the Kiwi Farms, or else I'd be missing essential pieces of the story that just simply aren't documented anywhere else. But just because it's a good place to find information doesn't necessarily mean it's a good place. The platform was originally launched in 2013 as a centralized place to discuss and monitor the various online activities of Chris Chan, arguably the first person on the internet to enter this twisted symbiotic relationship with their detractors. Soon enough though, the forum would expand to track the activities of other controversial internet figures. While some of these influencers and creators partook in the arrangement, feeding the trolls in exchange for money and attention, not everybody did. In fact, some of them weren't even influencers or creators at all. They were just regular people that unfortunately drew the forum's eye. And for these individuals, the Kiwi Farms took on an even darker role in their lives. Canadian was one of these victims. In early 2016, a user would create a thread about her, complete with an extremely mean-spirited biography along with links to her Facebook profiles and even her OkCupid account. This would lead to 200 pages of discussion about her, with her entire digital presence being completely deconstructed and analyzed. Anything embarrassing she ever posted was dredged up and put on display to be commented on. Let me be clear here. This isn't some washed up YouTuber or streamer. This is just some random person the Kiwi Farms collectively decided to gang stalk. The harassment would continue and escalate until it was just too much, and would ultimately take her life on June 29, 2016, just 1 month after her 19th birthday, and only 5 months after the Kiwi Farms began targeting her. It was the first death connected to the forum, which would result in significant attention from the mainstream media, who would be quick to blame the continued harassment from the platform's users as the main culprit in John's death. The site's creator would release a flippant pseudo-intellectual statement that inappropriately philosophizes about the nature of life and death, and also lambasts anyone who would assume Kiwi Farms played any part in the death of John. It wouldn't be long, however, before more deaths were connected to his forum. In June 2018, game developer self-immolate in a public park. Her thread on Kiwi Farms had been running for 3 years. Around the same time, a thread would be started about a software developer famous for creating several notable Super Nintendo emulators. Upon seeing the hateful discussion about him, would send an email to the creator of Kiwi Farms. He'd beg him to delete the thread, even offering up his entire life savings and free software development services for the site. If the thread wasn't deleted, he threatened to take fatal action against himself, making sure to include graphic descriptions of how he would accomplish the act. Kiwi Farms' creator would refuse, citing legal concerns about accepting the money. But indeed ended all shortly after sending those emails, specifically citing the Kiwi Farms as the catalyst for his decision. The following year, users who tried to access snapshots of the Kiwi Farms in the Internet Archive would be met with a white screen bearing the message:
This URL has been excluded from the Wayback Machine.
As I said earlier, this was a very rare decision by the Internet Archive, one of only a handful of cases where content was designated to be too dangerous to be remembered. Critics would argue that it was hypocritical for the organization to keep up other controversial platforms while specifically targeting the Kiwi Farms for deletion. But keep in mind that phrase I just used, too dangerous to be remembered. While the Internet Archive has never publicly clarified why they blocked the site, I think the explanation is actually fairly simple and practical. You see, the Kiwi Farms is full of sensitive private information that was acquired and put on display without the victim's knowledge. Preserving access to this information isn't so much a matter of historical record as it is keeping a doxing index alive. There's a difference between content that reflects dangerous ideologies and content that is itself dangerous all on its own. So in that sense, banning the Kiwi Farms was a pragmatic decision. I'm not sure if the mainstream press really understood that, or the Kiwi Farms in general. They described the platform like it's some organized effort by methodically evil people to ruin lives. While the forum very much did ruin people's lives, I think the way the press tells these stories offers a bit too much credit to the Kiwi Farms. Having snarky discussions about public figures is a common thing both online and offline, but the difference with the Kiwi Farms is that the platform is centered around documenting, not just discussing. These people aren't just hate-watching the latest H3H3 podcasts to talk about with each other later. They're making active efforts to chronologically archive the digital footprints of small-time creators and sometimes even just random people. This takes an immense amount of time and effort. Think about the source of people who have so much time to dedicate to such unimportant work. Pair that with the lack of socialization it takes to not care how harmful doing so can be to others, and suddenly, things start to make sense. Your average Kiwi Farms user isn't some conniving sadist. They're just very troubled people who are often stuck at home and have just as many, if not more, problems than the figures they document. They spend their lives obsessing about the minute faults in other people, while simultaneously ignoring their own. Many of them are neurodivergent in some way, and the people they document just so happen to be their hyperfixations. When the harassment escalates, it's not because of any organized effort. More often than not, it's because one person saw the escalation as an opportunity to insert themselves into the story, and in turn gain a bit of attention and notoriety from their fellow users, a form of validation they may be lacking in their personal lives. Kiwi Farms is nothing more than a chaotic collective of extremely troubled terminally online internet users who simply have nothing better to do with their lives, not a group of capable evil hackers persuading others to off themselves. Look, I'm not trying to minimize the horrible things that happen on this gang stalking website, but I think it's important to present it as it is, something the mainstream media fails to do. They discuss the neurodivergence of the victims at great lengths, but never analyze that aspect of the Kiwi Farms users themselves, or really even the interpersonal dynamics of the site at all, leading to the stories only ever being half told. Put it like this, if there was a group of people doing what the Kiwi Farms does, but in the real world, you know the news would be clamoring to figure out everything they could about them, like they do with all the criminals they cover. But because it's on the internet, they just don't even make the slightest attempt to learn about the thing they're reporting on. It harkens back to the days of the media running stories about the hacker known as 4chan. Except that was a decade ago, and I'm not sure the news should get a pass on being so lazy with trying to understand internet culture anymore, given how important it's become in the modern world. If you do want to read an actual good article about the Kiwi Farms, I highly recommend checking out this long-form write-up on Mother Jones. It was the only one I could find that actually made an earnest attempt to investigate its subject, and it's a great read. And yes, Kiwi Farms was removed simply because the information hosted on the site was potentially damaging to people. And by mirroring it, the Internet Archive would only be amplifying that danger. It's nothing more than that. And in fact, that's how the story tends to go. The organization voluntarily removes archive content unprompted, which is a very rare occurrence. Much more commonly, their hand gets forced. While the Internet Archive may have started purely as a project to preserve the internet, it wouldn't take them long to expand their mission to include preserving offline media as well. They'd introduce a feature where users could upload basically whatever they want to the archive, and the organization would also regularly undertake projects to restore and preserve different types of media en masse, the biggest of which was the Open Library Project. Starting in 2007, this initiative aimed to catalog and preserve every book ever published. Over the next decade and a bit, they'd copy and archive 1.4 million works, each of which had an accompanying digital copy that could be lent out one at a time, much like a physical book at a real library. During COVID though, the organization would make a critical error. In the peak of the lockdowns, they would launch something called the National Emergency Library, temporarily removing the one digital copy per book rule and allowing an unlimited number of digital copies of each book to be lent out to users at the same time. Publishers were not happy about this, and a coalition of 4 major publishing houses would end up filing a massive lawsuit against the Internet Archive. The publishers would win, and the archive ended up having to remove more than 500,000 books from their library. Brewster Kahle would label this as an immense setback to the site's mission. Unfortunately, this was just the beginning, as the lawsuit seemed to paint a target on the organization's back. In 2023, a coalition of record labels would file a different copyright lawsuit over the archive's Great 78 project, an initiative that preserved and archived more than 400,000 78-speed records, a music medium that hasn't been produced since 1960. The organization would end up having to remove a decent portion of the collection. Things would get even worse in 2024, when news websites began blocking the Internet Archive en masse. Their fears were that AI companies were downloading site captures to use as training data. And unfortunately, it was found that both Meta and Google had indeed broken the platform's terms of service and used archived websites to train AI models. 2025 would see an 87% decline in fresh archive snapshots of news websites, to the dismay of the journalists themselves, 100 of whom would sign an open letter in support of the foundation, advocating for its importance in an internet where everything is constantly changing and information is usually governed by big corporations with a financial interest, which in turn renders access to it fluid and unreliable. The exact problem Brewster Kahle attempted to fix all the way back in 1996. The most recent setback happened with Reddit almost fully removing itself from the Wayback Machine. They too would cite fears of AI companies using archived data as training material. Reddit would very much prefer to make a bit of cash selling your post history to AI companies themselves. This video started with the rise of Rotten.com and the Internet Archive, 2 early online platforms designed by founders idealistic about the free and open access to information the web could potentially provide, a thought shared by many of their digital contemporaries. I wonder if that first generation of internet users think about the direction the information superhighway is currently heading. If you happen to be one of them, I would love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing, so you'll be telling the YouTube algorithm that you enjoy content like this, and it'll be more likely to recommend you similar videos in the future. And lastly, have a good night.